Okay. Okay, so let us begin our lecture. So today we're going to look at communication in teaching and learning. So far we have covered the first two topics. The introduction to education technology is in the pre-recorded lecture on Moodle. We have looked at teaching models and technology choice. And then we have also, today we're going to look at communication in teaching and learning. Why are we looking specifically at communication? Because that is the essence of the teaching and learning process. We are looking at communication, whether we are doing this verbally, in text, intended or unintended, we are doing communication. Our objective, whether you are the facilitator or teacher or the learner, is to get your point across and to win over the other person. So unless your point is driven across, if your point has not been driven across, then communication has not been done. Then most likely teaching and learning has not happened. So take an example now. I put up a pre-recorded lecture, but now nobody has accessed it, which means communication has not happened. So let us go through this session and see what it is, what it involves. So we start with the definition of communication, which in its simplest form refers to share or sharing. So when we look at the act of sharing in itself, it involves giving something of oneself to the other and also the other doing reciprocating. Now, with communication, it is whereas we are talking about information, we are actually, when anybody is carrying out any kind of communication, you're giving a part of yourself, because that information comes from one's thoughts, one's beliefs, anything that somebody believes in. For example, there would be no point in me teaching education, technology in education, if I didn't have an understanding for it, if I didn't have some kind of knowledge for it, if I didn't believe in it. Automatically one would pick up on that if I'm communicating something that I did not believe in, something that did not make sense for me. So I wouldn't be able to share what I didn't have. So the essence of communication, we already see the person, whoever is making that communication, must have some kind of understanding. It sometimes takes me back to the thinking that if you don't get feedback, then most likely the other person didn't understand. So they can't share what they didn't understand. Now, a key point to note is that communication refers to a reciprocal exchange of information. So like I said, if I don't get a feedback, let's say if I don't get a feedback from you about any information that I've brought forward, that essentially means communication didn't happen. And as we look at the definition, the formal definitions of communication, we will see that. Now, as we communicate, one of the things we must understand is that when somebody is trying to share something, there are things that are intended. For example, my intention is for us to understand what communication is in its fullest sense. But there are certain things that may come out as I communicate. There are certain things that may be unintended as I come out. One, maybe my accent may not come out very well, and I may mispronounce certain things. I may not be feeling well, and it may come out that maybe some words or certain things come out in a lazy format. And you will sense this. I might be angry with somebody. My emotions may come out. So communication, certain things may be unintended, others may be intended. Since we are using technology, maybe my bandwidth, my connection may not be good, and breaks may come in. That is something that is unintended. So as we communicate, we must take note of these things that come in to interrupt what we intend to bring out. Now, when we look at the definitions of communication, the formal definitions, we recognize that it isn't just a form of sharing, but as we dig deeper into understanding sharing, we note that there has to be a sender, the one who is sharing the information. There must be a message and there must be a recipient. So those three must be present. As we go further into the definitions, there will be other components that we shall find exist. Now, as you're sending the message, it isn't a must that the recipient must be immediately available. So again, I'll bring the example of the pre-recorded video. I was the sender, and the recording, the content is the message. But the recipient, you, for most of you, you haven't yet received it. So communication has not been complete. So, but however, it is ongoing. It is ongoing. So my intent as a sender, it still exists. My intention still exists, but communication has not yet been completed. That means the distance in time and space has not yet come together. So here, when you look at this point, when we say communication requires that the parties share an area of communication, you realize that our communication has not been complete because the platform we're using, which is Moodle, it's not yet common for all of us, because you as the receivers, you have not yet accessed the platform. I'm also expecting a feedback from you as far as that video is concerned, but because we don't yet have a common platform, communication has not been complete. So I come to the point which I've just been saying from the previous slide, so that unless the receiver has understood the message, the communication process has not been completed. Now, when you come to the academic side, when they begin to tell us about what communication is, especially in the teaching and learning process, although we hadn't yet come to what Brown what Brown says, we realize that when we look at communication itself, the technicalities of teaching and learning, we realize that communication essentially embodies all those tools and techniques that we use as facilitators, as teachers, and as learners. So if you're using a lecture slide, or if you're using a discussion, or you're using visual material, you're essentially communicating. Right now, we are using Zoom, we are using lecture slides, and we are using the mode of a lecture to communicate. So all of these things are a means of communication. We are essentially communicating, in the teaching profession. So if we bear in mind the definitions we've had before, it is imperative that we understand that unless the receiver understands what we're trying to say, communication will not have been completed. I gave you the example of the pre-recorded lecture slides, the lecture that I put up. Because you have not received it, which means you have not had time to listen, nor that means you have not understood it. That means communication has not been completed. That is just one example. Right now I'm communicating. My connection may fail, may break. That automatically affects what I'm trying to bring forward to you. What then that means communication has not been complete. Your side of the connection may fail. On the other side, maybe my accent may affect what I'm trying to deliver. Or maybe I may be low. I may not be speaking in an audible format. What does that mean? It affects my communication process. It could be that I didn't prepare my material well. Maybe my lecture slides are not arranged in a coherent format. That may affect my communication. I think it was to you that I explained that at one time in my class, many years back, I had a blind student. And when I first taught, I didn't know that I had a blind student. So a lot of my speech included things like, look here, see this, things like that, that obviously were not helpful to her. What that meant is that whatever I communicated that day to her was not clear. And maybe even for my students who had sight, it wasn't clear. But I think basically you may get the gist of what I'm trying to say, that even as we teach, even in a physical classroom or be it virtual, we may fail to bring our point across, which essentially means the communication process has not been completed. Before I go any further, I want to ask, do we have any questions so far, or have I not been clear? Has the point been made clear or not?
Yes, Doctor.
Okay.
Doctor,
Now,
maybe
yes,
I need
please.
some clarification.
Yes, please.
Yeah, this is John.
Yes, John.
Doctor, the signposts that we see on the road, yes.
Mm-hmm.
You are moving on the road and you see a signpost, no way through.
Okay.
Now, the one who put the signpost there was communicating that nobody should go through there.
Yes.
And he's not there. Now, when I'm passing, I will avoid going through because of the signpost.
Yes.
Now, how will be the one who put the signpost understand? Is it by people not going there? That will be the way forward to understand that message has been delivered, because people don't cross and go where they were refused. Then too, radio presenters, they present information on radios. But now after presenting, there is no alternative feedback that maybe I've presented this and people have heard and they are answering the ABC. Maybe, yes, Doctor.
Okay.
The
Okay.
clarification, Doctor.
Now, you've given two very interesting scenarios, radio presenters and roadside signposts. How would we know that if a roadside signpost has been understood? We imagine that the person who put up the signpost was giving direction. I believe the only way we can understand or the authority, if the authority that put up that signpost, the only way they would get it, that somebody, maybe people are getting it or are not getting it, is to see the number of violations. Take an example. We know we are supposed to keep left in Uganda, but if you find a huge number of people are keeping right, now we don't normally have signposts saying that keep left. As Ugandans, we know automatically. Why? From our driving lessons and the driving tests that we have taken. If for example, police noted that there are quite a number of people who have been reported to be driving on the right, then the first question they would be thinking of would be, can they find out those people if they took driving lessons in Uganda, and who gave them, if they have driving permits, for example, of Ugandan driving permits, and if they do have driving permits, who gave them those driving permits? Because they should have been tested. Now, likewise, for the signpost, I would imagine the issue would be for the authority that put up that signpost. They would try to, they would have reports on number of violations based on that signpost. Take an example, if we have a one-way street and the street clearly states there's one way, yet there's police which reports that this number of drivers have been caught using the road in a wrong way. Then either there was no signpost, or there was a signpost and the road users didn't understand. Then that authority, would imagine the authority is the one which put up that signpost. They would most likely have to find out if the signpost was not understood, if it wasn't clear. Then that's when the questions would arise. They would find out from those who broke the rules why they did, if they saw the signpost in the first place, and if they did see it, did they understand it? That for me would probably be the question. The other one was on radio presenters. Now, I'm not an expert on radio presenters, but from what I have seen, whenever a radio presenter has a section to present, maybe you may have I'm just trying to remember, I'm not a very good radio listener, but the ones I've seen is maybe the drive home show, the early morning show, something like that. They usually have small programs or small interludes within a program where they ask for feedback, where they ask for call-ins or some people to send in messages. I think that is one way of trying to understand if they are being listened to, and if they are being listened to, how relevant they are. I think even radio stations gauge on the popularity of a certain show or even a certain presenter from that feedback they get, especially with call-ins. That's what I imagine. They may have other ways to measure, again, because I'm not very good with radio, I'm not a keen radio listener, but I imagine that. Many times when I was traveling from Kampala going to Nkozi, usually on Sunday evenings, there were usually political talks. All the way from Kampala to Nkozi, there were political discussion forums on radio stations. And I used to hear call-ins, people calling in to make contributions to the discussions. I think that is one way radio presenters receive feedback on radio presentations. John, I don't know if I've answered your question.
Doctor, you have.
Okay, thank you.
Is it okay, doctor?
Okay.
Yes.
Now, is there any other question? No, let's move on. Okay. So now, when we look at communication, we realize that it's actually a cycle. It's an iterative cycle where you have the sender and then there is a receiver. Then at a certain point, these roles interchange, where the receiver becomes a sender, especially when the receiver is giving feedback. Then the roles change. And at that point, the message of the receiver, who now becomes a sender, must be received by the first sender and understood. Take an example. When John asked me a question, I needed to understand. there are times when you have seen people in a discussion where the person who is giving feedback asks a question and the other person says, could you please rephrase that question? Mostly because the other one has not understood. And the reason for asking is so that communication can continue. Now, in communication itself, we have types of communication. And when we look at them, and we go back to the second lecture we had, which looked at teaching models, you'll see that there's a very close relationships. So now in teaching and learning, the communication types go hand in hand with the teaching models. So as you see them in this slide, interpersonal, group, public, and interpretive, they go hand in hand with the teaching models. So let's go through them one by one. The first one, interpersonal, which looks at one-on-one conversations. So typically, we would see this when we see a teacher and the student discuss one-on-one, or even within a classroom, two students discussing a specific topic. So that is typically interpersonal communication. So this one comes about when we have a situation when one is trying to persuade another to their point of view. Take examples. Let us say when you have a student who may not have understood the point that was raised. Just an example is just now when I had a discussion with John, where John raised the issue of how would feedback be provided in a roadside signpost, or in a case of radio presenters. And I began to discuss with John to persuade him, to show him how feedback would be given. That was a one-on-one situation. Another would be, let us say, if we had this lecture and maybe somebody didn't understand and said, okay, let me send Sheba a message via WhatsApp or via email. That would be an interpersonal communication. Then there would be the group communication. So typically, this is where you would have a social group. For example, our WhatsApp group, that's a typical example of a social group. That one is a group communication. I have just put up a discussion forum question for you. That is a typical example of group communication. Although you have not yet contributed, you have not yet read through, but that would be a typical example of group communication. So group communication would essentially be where you have a group discussion where a certain number of people come to discuss one particular point. Later on, we shall look at different ways to have group discussions, a group communication, so that we can encourage problem-solving style of learning, teaching and learning. Then we have what we call public communication. So this is typically, for example, what I'm doing now when we have the lecture style of teaching, where you have one speaker and the rest are listening. That is typically public communication. One such example, an example I can give you is, for example, I have when I've seen public communication, yes, we've seen it now in our teaching and learning contexts. Normally, we see it in our everyday classroom. This style of teaching is typically in a situation where you have an expert coming in to bring forward, to teach something. So a typical example, a perfect example would be in a church. Traditionally in a church, you have a pastor, a reverend, a priest, imam or sheikh is standing up to teach. And the religious, the clergy, the person who would be the clergy would be considered the expert, and that person is delivering a point of view. Now, in teaching and learning, sometimes this is seen, it's frowned upon. We shall discuss that a bit when we look at problem-solving style of teaching or method of teaching. In teaching and learning nowadays, this style of delivering content is frowned upon nowadays. Although I wouldn't disregard it as a form of teaching, a teaching method or communicating. I wouldn't disregard it completely. There are times when you need first to set aside and allow an expert to deliver, to bring forward the concept of something. There are times that is there. However, in today's thinking, the idea is that the students we are teaching, be it a pupil or whatever it is, they are not empty vessels. They have some kind of knowledge of something. And the objective is to try and coax them to bring them to a fuller understanding, with them first bringing forward the knowledge that they have. Then the teacher comes in to formalize it. That is the thinking today. And I think that is the idea. I'm sure all of you know about the new teaching curriculum for secondary school, which has been revamped to take on this new philosophy in teaching method. But however, we realize that we really can't say that public communication can be done away with. No. Ultimately, the role of the teacher cannot be taken out. Then the fourth one, our last one, is interpretive communication. So this one is typically what we see with television, radio, and magazine. And in the teaching process, we also see it a lot when you have a situation where you need students to go and think about something and then bring forward their thought on a specific topic. So for me, my earliest, let's say, my earliest encounter with this style of communication was when I was doing literature at A level. If any of you has done literature, you know when they give you, let's say, a play, a written play, or a piece of text, and you're asked to go and read it and interpret it. Oh, this character said this. What could that mean? You try to come up with that. That would be interpretive communication. It kind of gives the learner an independent time to go and think about something. Now, when I put up the recorded, pre-recorded video, that was kind of trying to bring forward the lecture mode of delivery, but try to bring interpretation out of it, where I leave you, the learners, to try and understand and then have a discussion after. That was one way of trying to merge some of these two types of communication, that is public and interpretive communication. But you let me know once you look at it and what you may think about it. Before I go further to the elements, can we have, can I have any feedback from you on what you think about these? If it's clear, if it is not, if I need to make anything clearer.
Doctor.
Yes, please, John.
Maybe I'm seeking for clarification.
Yes, please.
Hello?
Yes, please, I can hear you, John.
Now, according to interpretive communication, you are saying someone communicates and someone tries to pick meaning out of it.
Yes, please.
Now, in the born again churches,
yes,
the pastor preaches in English and someone translates.
Yes.
How could we term that one? Is that also interpretative communication?
I think what
Wait.
that one is that the person is translating. The person is translating, the person is not
Yes.
necessarily interpreting. So interpreting is where you're trying to understand, you're trying to make meaning of something. Typically, what I would give you an example of is I think Edwin is an English teacher, not so?
No, I'm a Luganda teacher.
Luganda teacher. Who was there was a person who gave us, I think, I don't know if it was Edwin, who gave us a nice example on English last time when we had the lecture. Now, typically, I'll give you an example in literature. I remember the literature I did at A level, especially when we would do things like either novels or plays. And I'll give you an example. One of them, I can't remember the title, but there was one particular character where there was a lady who had had a strenuous relationship with the husband. Now, in the end, when the husband was trying to apologize, and she tried to say, the response she gave him, it was almost like she was trying to say sorry, but the woman was saying that I can't remember the exact words, but I remember the teacher asking us, what does she mean? Because she didn't outrightly tell the husband, I forgive you, and she didn't outrightly say, I'm not forgiving you. But essentially, the teacher was trying to tell us, why was she not committing herself to forgiving the husband? And the interpretation behind it was, essentially, she meant, this is something we have to work out through as a couple. I can't outrightly forgive you because you have been hard on me. The husband had been unforgiving towards her because of an affair she had, a mistake she made while he had been detained as a political fighter. So she had gone ahead and unintentionally, or one would say intentionally, how would you make such a blunder? But she ended up having a one night stand with an arch enemy of his, and she gave birth to a child. Although she dearly loved the husband, she made this mistake in a moment of weakness. But when the husband came back, he was particularly cold to her, and for a long period of time. So even in the end, when she had tried to remain faithful and to be repentant, so in the end, when he tried to ask for forgiveness and tried to reconcile, her response was not complete. Why? And the interpretation, of course, the interpretation now was for us now as young people to understand why she said what she said. Of course, for most of us who were quite young, like myself, that time of my A level, I didn't understand much about relationships, and I got it completely wrong. Looking back now, I would have interpreted it very well if I had had a bit more maturity. But that is the case. But that is a typical example of interpretive communication, where you're trying to understand the emotions of somebody as they say something. Other things would probably be things like the Bible itself. Let us say the Bible. John, you've given an example of a pastor. When a pastor is teaching, a pastor, a priest, a reverend, any of these religious leaders, what essentially they are giving is an interpretation of scripture, either from the Quran or from the Bible. Sometimes even, let's say, like for the Catholic Church in particular, they would be looking at the teachings of the church, the Bible plus the teachings. That's where the interpretation comes from. So essentially, they'll be interpreting, because when you look at anything scripture-like, it requires some interpretation. You can't simply take things at face value. So that requires interpretation. Unlike the translator, the one who is changing what the pastor is saying from English to Luganda or Luganda to English, the other way around, that is translation. But the Bible itself or the Quran has to be interpreted by preferably what would be a theologian, somebody who would be a scripture scholar or something like that. That would be another example of interpretation. I hope I'm clear, John.
Doctor, it is okay.
Okay. Let's move to the second element, which is elements of communication. So now here, we are saying, we are essentially looking at what we had earlier said. We can have a brainstorming exercise to see what elements they are, but we can just simply go to what elements of communication that exist. Now, you'll find from literature or from academics, the academic side, different people have different formats. They will name a number of them, but essentially, all communications have these basic elements. Shannon points out 6 of them. One, there is the source, the one that produces the message. Then you have the sender, the transmitter. That is the one that operates the message. So here Aristotle says this would be the speaker. The speaker would be the sender. So many times the source and the sender may be one and the same. Other times you may have the source being different from the sender. What do I mean? Let us give examples of certain offices have, I forget the term, but the person who speaks on behalf, let's say the person who speaks, the spokesperson, yeah, let's say that would be the spokesperson. For example, the president would have a spokesperson. Have certain political leaders, for example, like Robert Kyagulanyi automatically has a spokesperson. Besigye would have a spokesperson. The US president would have a spokesperson. The Vatican has a spokesperson. The spokesperson may not necessarily be the source. You may have a public relations office which comes out with a message, something like that. So you may find sometimes the source is not necessarily the same as the sender. Not always the same set. When you're teaching, for example, I'm a lecturer now, I'm teaching. Not everything that I've taught you comes from me. For example, here, I'm quoting Shannon. So I'm not necessarily the source. Although I am the sender right now. It is me who has gathered the information and I'm giving it to you. But I'm not necessarily the sender. Most of the content that I've given you doesn't come from Sheba per se. It has been picked from several sources, put together, and I'm giving it to you. Then we have the channel, the means by which we transmit the signal. So, for example, now I'm using Zoom. We could be using a physical classroom. I could have written this. I'm also using PowerPoint. That's also another channel. So I'm using several channels to bring forward this message to you. Then the fourth is the receiver, the person who is receiving. Now, remember from our first definition, we understand that the roles of sender and receiver can interchange. Then we have the destination. So again, the receiver and destination can be one and the same. So take an example. I put up, I recorded the pre-recorded lecture I talked about. I pre-recorded it with the intention of putting it in Moodle. Moodle is the channel, but it's also the destination. But I also intended that the destination is you, the student, so that you become the destination and the receiver at the same time. The fifth would be the message. That is the actual content, the actual information. So this would be the communication or the statement, either verbal, written, recorded. This would be the message itself. Then finally, we have the feedback. So the feedback, the person sending the feedback could be this, again, the roles interchange. So the feedback can be positive or it can be negative. Or it could be uncertainty, whatever the case. So here we have a diagram which essentially gives you the visual effect of the communication process. So when you look at this image, you realize that it is a cycle that is going on. Any questions so far on the elements of communication?
To me, Doctor, I think you are clear.
Okay. So we move on?
Yes, Doctor.
Yes, we move.
So then let's look at characteristics of a good communicator, because these are things that as lecturers, as facilitators, as teachers, these are characteristics that we must strive to achieve. So the objective is that you must make an effort to be ranked as a good communicator by your students. Now, I remember one of the first things our Vice Chancellor said. Remember one of the speeches he gave us in one of our staff meetings. He said, when you're teaching, teach with your heart. Don't go into the classroom as a technocrat or as the expert, because the minute you become an expert, your mindset is, I'm here to deliver my content and that's it. I don't care whether you receive it, whether you understand or anything like that. And here it is really a key point. Here, when I think of this, I remember when I had just joined UMU as a lecturer in the Faculty of Science. We were told as lecturers that we were supposed to take up a certification course on networking. Now, this is purely an IT thing. So this certification course essentially requires anyone who is taking it to take on several, should I say, modules or course units, and each module has several sessions which must be graded. So you take them, and before you can move to the next module, you have to undergo a test, and which test the pass mark is 75. So if you fail the first attempt, the next attempt, you move to 85. Now, we had two facilitators. Now, specifically, this is just my personal experience. I don't think it would be right to judge these two as one good and the other bad. But from my personal opinion, this was just my personal opinion, I felt one of the facilitators was a much better communicator than the other. Why? For me, the first communicator was really, I felt, was a bully. The kind who would teach and then ask you a question. If you failed, he'll tell you, stand up and don't sit down. And remember, we were lecturers. This was a fellow colleague, and he's telling his fellow lecturers, stand up and don't sit because you failed to answer a question. And within that class, we had students that we were teaching, which was really belittling. So for me, I developed kind of a hardened heart. And several of us, I think, when the modules came, we failed and we had to repeat. Now, this was opposed to, and I remember this particular lecturer, when we were moving to the second module, we asked him about it and he said, oh, that module is very hard. Even me, who was trying to point him the expert, he failed it. Now, when the second facilitator came to take us through that second module, he remember the first thing he told us, he said, people have told you this thing is hard. He said, no, it's not hard. It's just how you deliver it. And he went ahead to deliver it in the simplest way. And I passed all the sessions without failing. Because for me, in my opinion, that lecturer, that facilitator taught from the heart. His intention was to make things, to break down information to the simplest format before delivering. So I think he communicated well, but that was just my opinion. So one, according to me, and I think what that lecturer did was to share information. His intention was not just to show us that he was the expert, but was to share his knowledge, that we too got his knowledge. Two was to discuss, the thing he did next was to discuss the feelings, because the first thing he asked was that they've told you this thing is hard. Do you believe that? We said yes. So he said, let me alleviate your fear. And he broke down what we thought was hard into the simplest format, and we all got it. Then he persuaded us that what we thought was hard was actually simple. That is one of the things he did. For me, those are the things that I remember, particularly about that facilitator. Then following social rituals. And I think this is where he really came down to our level, and he didn't put himself above us. He really came down to our level. Then using imagination. Again, this is where he broke down things to our level. This is where something that is unknown to the person you're communicating to, you bring it down to the level, to something that they understand, something they have seen on a daily basis. Associating something with things they see every day within the family, maybe within their social groups. You bring it down to the level that people understand. You bring from the known to the unknown. Anything you may want to share, or anything you may have not understood on characteristics of a good communicator? Are we okay?
Can I say
Yes.
using yes, doctor.
Yes, please. Using.
I'm just inquiring.
Yes, please.
Can I say that using imagination could be a method that one brings up a situation while is trying to explain something that can make the point home?
Yes, please. That is exactly what it is. That is exactly what it is. I remember.
Thank you, Doctor.
I remember when I was teaching programming to my IT students, and I was trying to and help them understand the issue of inheritance. Now, in software programming, it is something else, but inheritance, I just gave them an example that each one of you in this class, you have a parent, you have a father, you have parents, you have a father and a mother. You've had people say, oh, this one took his father's nose. Oh, this one took his mother's eyes. Things like that. You've inherited the looks from your parents. You can also inherit property from your parents. Things like that. So I would translate that into software programming so that they understand the similarities, so that their imagination, the person uses what they know, understands using what they know. Let's look at barriers to effective communication. So we had actually talked about some of these things, and things that are actually unintentional. They may help, or they may actually bring about failure. So we've seen one of them. We've seen one of them. We've just experienced it. I tried to communicate to you a video, but because you failed to log in into a platform, that was a technical barrier. But however, in our communication, even now, maybe in the video, I may have used some non-verbal messages. There may have been noise as I recorded. I specifically remember it might have been with your group or with another. As I was trying to record, there was I'm home, I'm in my home in the village, and we have some movement of vehicles in the compound. There was a tractor leaving, and I was thinking, oh my goodness, I hope the students don't hear this. And I didn't want to necessarily repeat, but I really hope that that noise didn't contradict. Right now, here in the village, we're dependent on solar. Once the solar runs out, we put on a generator. So there's a generator running in the background. So it may or may not affect my communication right now. So that kind of noise. There may also be certain barriers which may come through from maybe personal biases, or as you see here, selective perception, emotions, language, things like that. Let me just give you an example. There was a time I attended a PhD, should I say symposium? It wasn't necessarily a defense, where different PhD students were presenting how far their work had gone. And there was a lady who was presenting part of her findings, and she was doing research specifically on the subject of the issue of land disputes that were happening between Bunyoro and Buganda. And as she was presenting her work, it became clear, and even some of the professors who were listening immediately said that we can tell that you're emotionally attached to this thing. They actually told her that we advise you to change your topic because your emotions are coming through. So now in research, anyone who is embarking on research, or some of you may be taking research methodology as a course, and one of the things they emphasize is objectivity. So your emotions must not come out as you're communicating your research. So emotions can come out. I may come to teach you, and maybe I've just had a big quarrel with somebody, a family member, or maybe I've had I'm at loggerheads with some people in maybe with some of my colleagues. That can automatically affect my teaching. I remember one time when I was in secondary school, and some of the senior teachers had a fight with the headmistress. And when one of the teachers came to our class, she was visibly still angry, and she couldn't even continue with the lesson. So those are typical examples. Political correctness, gender differences, and political correctness. When we were being trained to start going online, I remember one of the things that a group of lecturers were teaching us is that we must consider gender as we teach. So simple things like they were saying that when you're teaching, simple things like saying policeman or saying chairman instead of chairperson, things like that. Or if people talk about a police officer and you automatically imagine it's a man. Those were things that were not being gender sensitive, and we were being told that these can actually cause barriers to communication. Political correctness is another key point. I don't know if many of you followed the story or followed the presidential life of Donald Trump. This is my personal opinion, and again, it's my personal opinion. I think a lot of Donald Trump's problems came because he simply was not politically correct. I don't think he was necessarily a bad man, but I think most of his problems came because he just was not politically correct. A lot of things, when you see the political figures, they avoid commenting on certain things because it may cause ripples in certain areas. I may come to communicate to you now, and maybe we've just finished an election, and with our election, it would be madness to imagine, everybody I'm talking to maybe is a big supporter of Mugisha Muntu, or is a big supporter of Robert Kyagulanyi, or is a Museveni supporter. If I'm not sensitive to that, then seriously there must be something wrong. So as I teach, I would have to be sensitive to say, let me be neutral. Whatever I say, as far as Uganda's politics are concerned, let me be neutral, because I don't know what the other person feels, what the other person, what the stand of the other person is. And more so when we're using technology, we have to be extremely careful. Why? Right now I'm talking to you, I don't see your faces. I may say something that may offend you. So I must be careful about what I say. I must try to be as neutral as possible, not to bring in my opinion, especially on terms of politics. I can't give you an opinion. For example, now I gave you an opinion of a teacher, somebody who taught me. But I can comfortably say this was a personal experience. None of you was part of it. So you may not, so there I can give you a personal opinion. I can give you an opinion of Donald Trump is now out of office. Although I can give you an opinion not insulting him and not overpraising him. Something like that, but try to be as much as possible not to offend, because the minute you do, you create what is referred to as a hardened religion, what is referred to as a hardened heart, where the person may say, I'm not going to listen to this person anymore, because he or she is biased maybe about my political beliefs, my religious beliefs, or anything for that matter. Then there is a lack of appropriate knowledge may cause a language barrier or communication barrier. Take an example. If I decide to talk about something or to talk about something of a medical nature, for example, if I decide to talk about COVID, I can talk about COVID, the COVID pandemic, as a lay person. I may talk about maybe how it has driven us to go online. I may talk about the SOPs. I may talk about the hardships that come with trying to follow the SOPs, or the economic hardships it has brought into my life. But if I try to talk about the virus itself, for example, its genetic makeup, and so on and so forth, I'm bringing myself into an area which I have no idea about, and I really shouldn't. Because then here I would probably confuse you, and I will confuse myself. So one of the key points we must take note of as we teach, you try as much as possible to have a good grasp of your subject which you're going to deliver. Try to have a good grasp. However, that said, it doesn't mean you will know everything. If you at any point you're asked something you don't know, then clearly state, oh, I don't have an answer for this. I'll give you an answer, maybe in our next session, or I'll send you a response once I've read more on this subject. Let me just give you just a breakdown of these. So the communication barriers can be external. Take an example. if the network fails right now, that's an external barrier. It's out of my control. It's an internal barrier if, for example, I have not read widely on the subject I'm going to give you. That's an internal barrier. Or if at the very moment I have an emotional breakdown, or there's something that has disturbed my emotions at any particular point, that's an internal barrier. I may have a lack of interest in the subject. This could be on my side, me who is teaching you. It could be on the side of the students. There may be a lack of interest. And this one particularly you notice when you're teaching a group of students and you're asking and there's no feedback. For me as a lecturer, I have experienced this when I'm teaching undergraduates. Normally, there is a lack of interest. Sometimes it's mostly because students come to learn because maybe my parents told me I have better things to do, maybe meet up with a group of friends and I really don't want to respond. That normally happens with undergraduate students. But the key point is trying to pick their interest or trying to emphasize the need for people picking up an interest. Failure to listen. Now, this can be on the part of the listener or on the part of the sender, the lecturer. You may fail to listen to your students. I gave you the typical example of a lecturer or a teacher who simply wants to go into a classroom because they are technocrats, they are the experts, but not necessarily because they are teaching from the heart. Failure to clarify comments. It goes back to all of these childhood teachings. This could be the way somebody was brought up. There are situations when maybe in your speech, the way you deliver, it is affected by certain things that you picked up from childhood. I'll give you an example. One time we were going through training on, again, teaching and learning, and there was one of our colleagues kept adding the word "what" to everything. Like, for example, says the what, things like that. That may have been picked up from childhood, some childhood habits. Now here, this is a key point, failure to see a person as an individual. This one is a key point. When we are using ICT, this is a key point because especially when we don't see the person, or when we're teaching a huge class and we simply don't have the time to see that individual who may not have understood something. Those are key points. Or it could be just prejudices, just simple prejudices that exist. I'll give you an example. Each one of us comes from different tribes. Now, we all have different prejudices when it comes to tribes. So you've had things like, for example, as a Mtoro, I've had things like, oh, the Batoro are lazy. Now imagine if I was in a class with a teacher who had that belief. And this person, if I asked a question, their mindset was, this person is just lazy. And I'm not going to pay attention to this person. That would be a prejudice that has affected the person, that teacher seeing me as a person. Interruptions. So the interruptions can come again from both sides. Take an example, if I'm teaching you and I'm receiving phone calls at the same time. This would severely affect my communication. Lack of self-confidence. So all of these are key points to note. Some are within your control, some are not within your control. So take an example of external communication barriers, for example, like network failure. Those are beyond our control. Or the other example would be you failing to access the Moodle platform. Those are beyond. We try to work around them, and we even in ICT, if you're using technology especially, we shall also see things like have a plan B, just in case plan A fails, have a plan B. So for example, if I have network failure using one network, I would say, let me use, if I'm using MTN, let me try using Airtel, something like that, having a plan B. Do we have any questions so far? No? Do you have any questions so far as
Doctor,
yes, please.
I think, Doctor, for me, on my side, we are together.
Okay. Any question from anyone else? Any comments? Okay, let's move to this slide then, which is looking at challenges to communication across cultures. Now, as we communicate, especially in the teaching, in the classroom, either be it virtual or physical, we realize everyone comes, people come from different backgrounds, different homes, and even if you have you come from the same family. This I've seen in my own family. Even if you come from the same family, for example, I have siblings. I have 3 siblings. Each one of us has a different character. You may find one person is likes to be very clear as they communicate. My younger sister in particular, when you ask her a question, she will be extremely elaborate to even beyond the norm. My nieces and nephews, when they ask her something, then they realize, oh my goodness, I've got myself into problems. She'll give you a whole lecture. Then I have another sister who loves feedback. She wants to know you're listening. She wants to know you've understood what she's saying. She wants that reaffirmation. Then there is me. I'm very, when I have an opinion, I want to make sure that it goes above and beyond, and I state it and make it clear. And I'm extremely so. Each one of us has a different way we communicate. But when we are now doing it in a professional, in teaching and learning, we need to understand that we may come across, our class may be made up of people from different cultures, different backgrounds. The last thing we want to do is, first of all, to offend somebody, to fail to put forward our point across. And this is extremely important. I will give you an example. I'll give you just a story I experienced when I was doing my master's. So when I was doing my master's, I was amongst people from different nationalities. So in this one particular scenario, I was talking to somebody. I was with 2 people. One was Japanese, the other was Algerian, I think. So the Algerian gentleman was narrating a story, telling us that about a company which went to Japan to bring to take to them. They were introducing a yogurt, a type of a brand of yogurt into the yogurt, the yogurt that which is made from milk. So they were bringing a brand of yogurt into the Japanese market. So they got a sample of people. I gave them the different types of yogurt, and they were asking them, do you like it? And all these Japanese people would bow their heads and smile. They would give them the second type, they would bow their heads and smile. What they didn't know, now, after they did that, they took it that all these people like the yogurt. So they put it on the market, and the yogurt completely failed. Nobody bought it. What they didn't know was that in the Japanese culture, it's extremely rude to say, I don't like this thing. It's extremely rude. So probably the format in which they were trying to get feedback was not the appropriate format. They might have had to understand how Japanese communicate. Because the issue of being polite and rude is extremely important among the Japanese. So it's important that we understand the different vibes our body language may bring forward, the different ways our accent, the different words our accent, certain things may come out maybe extremely wrong, others may come out better. There are certain topics, for example, which we may not need to have when we are talking to certain people. Again, I'll give you an example when we talk about being politically correct. If you're discussing in a Ugandan context, if you're talking about a subject, for example, such as homosexuality, in Uganda, the way you discuss it is not the same way you discuss it, for example, in Europe. So it may not be a good idea to discuss your opinion of the subject outrightly in Europe. Slang and jargon. Certain words may be clearly understood in Uganda. I'll give you an example. In Uganda, to say this person ate the money, most Ugandans will understand what you mean. That may not be the case if you went, let's say, to England. The person, you may completely lose your audience if you use that term. What is formal and what is informal language? The tone, our gestures, the physical space and contact. Now, you find, I found that in Europe, people really prefer that you talk to them looking at them face to face. Now, for me, it was a little bit daunting for me because, especially for my case, being a lady, and the fact that I live a single life, to look at a man directly in the face for a long period, for me, it was a bit of a challenge. But as I took time with them, I realized that this is the way they communicate. In Europe, to look at somebody face to face, it shows you're being honest, that you're speaking honestly. Whereas for me, being a lady, it was a bit at first. I remember it was my first experience. I was a little bit scared, but of course I reminded myself that, oh, this is how Europeans communicate. The communication style. Some people are very formal. I'll give you an example. Here in Uganda, we very much treasure titles. To say Mrs. So-and-so, Dr. So-and-so, Professor so-and-so, Engineer so-and-so. Now, when I was doing my research in the Netherlands, they barely used the titles, barely. I remember my supervisor, the first time it took me a bit of time to call him by his first name. But eventually I got to understand that they rarely use their titles. Dress and appearance, gender, all these things. So all these things are key points to take note of. Is there any questions so far before we go to communicative activities?
Yes, doctor.
Yes, please.
Actually, you raised a good concern of a point of accent.
Yes.
There is a workshop I attended, and there are some. Then the presenter was pronouncing the word as Moson.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine that must.
So I got to know. At first I thought maybe he didn't understand the language very well, but then I was told that people of that certain culture, that's the accent. Then I realized that maybe, and the way I thought maybe he didn't understand English well, but actually when you raised it here, it reminded me that point when somebody wants to add motion as motion.
Yes.
Motion. Yeah.
Yeah, and you'll even notice. I noticed when you are looking at a video, maybe on the BBC website, when they're reporting on something, especially if they're interviewing somebody who is a non-British individual, they will normally put subtitles, even if the person is speaking English. Let's say, especially from Africa, from India, they'll always put subtitles because you just don't understand. I've seen situations where you're listening to an Irish national speaking, somebody from Ireland. The person is speaking English, but you can barely understand what they're saying. The accent is totally, really, really strong. Now, before I go further, I want to first ask, actually even somebody has said they're not able to finish. It's 9 o'clock. Should we continue or should we first hold on to this and then we meet? Well, I would have really preferred that we have another lecture before, but I'm also getting a bit clouded with my undergraduate classes. Should we stop here and then I first, because it's now 9 o'clock, most of you might be tired. Because there's a bit of a way to go. Let me see. Yeah, there's a bit more to discuss and I might lose you along the way. I'm thinking.
I see that we are now 3.
Yes, because somebody has fallen off. I think he has even sent a message that he has fallen off.
So we are now 3 including you.
Yeah, should.
So we are now 3 including you.
Okay, so I think let us stop here, and if it is possible to have another lecture, to catch up, because we're a little bit behind. You could discuss amongst yourselves and you let me know.
Okay, doctor.
Yeah. So let us stop here. Yeah, then I strongly urge everyone to contact David Musoke and you try to access Moodle.
Okay, doctor.
Okay, so let us, if you can arrange for another day, we meet again. If not, we meet on Thursday.
Okay, doctor.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome, doctor.